nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishvaram Namashristam manumapi shatriputramatra swarupam Rupam tasyagrajam urupurim maturim goshtavatim Radha kundam girivaramaho radhikamadavasham Praptoyasya pratita kripaya Shri Gurum tam natosmi Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jadar Raso Manovritir Prasannananam Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Muda Kedato Bande Bhagavatam Iman Anulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jahoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadanas Trinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Julisyam Janma Janmani. So by the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Svanamamrita Asadan Kari, Svabhavamrita Asadan Kari, Sva Atulaniya Madhurya Asvadan Kari, Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava acaryas, by whom his heart's desire that Bhakti Rasa Shastra be relished in this world was grandly fulfilled. Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we will continue our discussion of Sri Rupa Pad's Padyavali. So this will be our third discussion of verse 14, from an anonymous poet, which is illustrating the quality of prema being a great fortune, and doing so by illustrating how prema is difficult to attain or very rare to attain. So the reason for its rarity or difficulty is that to attain it, or to quote buy it, as the verse uses as a metaphor, the metaphor of purchase, the price that has to be paid is laulyam, or hankering, which Rupa Goswami speaks of as lobha in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and Jiva Goswami speaks of as ruchi in the Bhakti Sandarbha. So in the last discussion we heard more about the nature of that lobha, how it plays out, if you will, in the psyche, and also about how the sadhana of Raganuga-bhakti is performed, and in particular how there is a prominence within it of sadhana performed within the mind. So having discussed these points, and ultimately we left off with a statement of Radhakrishna Das Goswami explaining the idea of, quote, following ragatmika bhakti as being that of following the varieties of service performed by the group of Ragatmika Bhaktas whose bhav is the object of one's aspiration, performed with the aspiration of being blessed to receive within one's heart a bhava of that nature. So today we'll continue with this discussion and we'll hear about additional characteristics of lobha. So again, lobha or lolya is the price that has to be paid to achieve Raganuga-bhakti, to experience kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa, to experience or attain Krishna prema, which is the prayojana or the aim as determined by the theology of the Gaudiya Sampradaya. And we heard that the principal characteristic of this lobha is that the mind gravitates towards, it proceeds towards that object of desire, being motivated not by injunctions, not by reasoning, but by desire itself. Or when the mind is moving in this way, we can infer the presence of this desire as the impelling force or the driving motivation for the sadhaka's sadhana. So in addition to this characteristic of lobha that Rupa Goswami has explained, today we'll discuss other characteristics of this lobha, which are mentioned elsewhere in the works of Jiva Gosvami, Vishwanath Chakravarti, Sanatana Gosvami, and so forth, to give us more perspective about what is being referred to here as this eligibility for Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti. So picking up where we left off, I'll begin to read. Quote, in this way, Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti is to be understood as performing service akin to the service rendered by the Ragatmika Bhaktas whose specific raga one aspires to attain, wherewith the sadhaka is motivated by intense desire, that is, taste, ruchi, for that specific raga. And because of that intense desire or taste for that specific raga, and because that intense desire or taste for that specific raga is the fundamental eligibility for this path of bhakti, it was stated in the verse under discussion that, quote, hankering, laulyam, is the sole price that must be paid for, quote, awareness imbued with kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa, that is, Ragatmika Bhakti. So that is the concept we left off with, and that encapsulates what we've discussed so far. Sri Jiva Pad describes additional important characteristics of this hankering, laulyam, that is, this intense desire or taste, ruchi, for a particular bhava of a particular group of Ragatmika Bhaktas in his Bhakti Sandarbha. He describes its positive effect as that of producing constant intentness upon that Ragatmika Bhakti for which one has taste, that is, one-pointedness or akantitva upon it, and absorption in particular manners of expression of Ragatmika Bhakti that are very pleasing to the mind of Sri Bhagavan. So when there's when a cause is present, its effect will be perceived. So here he's describing the effects that are visible in the presence of the cause. So when the taste is there, when the hankering is there, the desire is there, then what effect will show that it's there? The effect will be that the mind becomes one-pointed upon the object that one has the desire, hankering, taste for. One will be continuously intent upon that. That will remain the focus of one's activities, the focus of one's thoughts, and so forth. And not only in the object itself, but in that which is related to the object, or the way that that bhava is expressed, the way that it is, the gestures, the behaviors, it's the place associated with it, etc. All of these things will become things that the mind becomes absorbed in. And it will be understood that all of these things are profoundly pleasing to Bhagavan. As we understand from the Goswami Siddhanta in general, the Brajabasis are the dearest of all of Bhagavan's associates. So when one has this type of hankering for that bhava of the residents of Braja, then all the features of expression, all the features of that domain will be understood to be what is most pleasing to Bhagavan and therefore most worthy of being given attention. Sri Chakravarti Pad elsewhere adds to this, that one with such intense desire will also have a very strong inclination, that's too many T's, accompanied by elation in relation to the means to attain the object of the intense desire. So not only will one have this desire for the object, but whatever is the means to attain the object, that also the person will have desire for and be excited about. They'll be strongly inclined to that. For example, we gave the example last time of people having greed for money. So when someone is very greedy for money, and then they get a good contract or a good job or a good means of making a lot of money, they become very happy and they become very intent upon performing that task or doing that job such that they will achieve the money. So their desire for the money is expressed or is inferred to be strong when they show great elation for achieving or for engaging in the means by which they will achieve the object. So when someone, works hard or studies hard or goes through a lot of tests and then finally, gets their dream job or something like this, then they become so much excited and so joyful and go about that work with such passion because they understand it to be the ideal means to fulfill their principal objectives. So this is what you can call a hierarchy of objects. When you have the primary object, then you have the means to achieve that object itself becomes an object, and one is then intent upon the means object in order to attain the ends object, if you will. So this is how Chakravarti Pad is showing this. So what that can then reflect, what that can be as a tool for introspection, is if someone is having this sense of, I want to achieve this goal, but then one is not very serious or not very intent upon going through the process that's necessary to achieve that goal, then actually maybe they don't truly desire that object so strongly. If their desire were strong, then their adherence to the means to fulfill it would also be commiserate. But if one is not specifically so interested in achieving the object, more so they're pursuing the object simply to avoid something else, then they may not show that much strong inclination towards fulfilling or going about the means to achieve the object. So this is also something to reflect on as far as waging the strength of one's desire. How much does that desire actually translate into the capability to channel one's thoughts and energy and time into what is most productive to achieve that goal? When that capability to channel, to focus is strong, then that's indicative of the strength of the desire to achieve. So this is another principle. And we go on here. So saying, meaning, one will eagerly engage in the practices that lead to the attainment of that bhava one so desires. In this regard, he further explains that such inclination becomes indomitable. Quote, one who is truly intensely desirous may attain or may not attain the desired object, but regardless cannot give up one's eagerness for it. So, if one really wants something, then even their own failure will not, they won't be cowed down even by their own failure. Or even if they see that they're far away, they'll still remain intensely desirous of pursuing it. Reminds me of a passage in the Chaitanya Bhagavat where Mahaprabhu on one occasion, he he excluded his childhood friend and dear bhakta Mukunda because he was unhappy with some of Mukunda's social behaviors. So he said, Mukunda is not allowed in to join with us as he normally comes, which was a strong measure to show that his disapproval of Mukunda's behavior. So when Mukunda arrived and was not given entrance, then he inquired, how long will I be excluded? When will I get the chance to come back again? And this question was relayed to Mahaprabhu, and Mahaprabhu, in a stern manner, I believe he said something like, a crore of lifetimes or a lakh of lifetimes, some huge period of time, would be extremely daunting. If you were to hear this type of news, you might be crushed, so to speak, or you might give up hope. You might say, oh, I'll never achieve that. That's impossible. That's so far off. That's so extreme. And one might think, oh, better to give up this desire. It's too far-fetched. But when Mukunda got this news, then he was elated and he started to celebrate. And everyone was shocked, thinking, this is such severe, heavy statement that he'll be excluded for so long. And yet he's reacting with such elation. How is it possible? So for him, he was elated because this gave him assurance. This gave him the feeling that, yes, I will get what I truly want. If I have to wait for it, that's fine. But the fact that he was completely firm and clear in what he wanted, and he was certain that he would get it, so because of that intensity of his desire, whatever the wait was, that's all right. So when Mahaprabhu got this news that this was Mukunda's reaction, then he said, okay, call him in now. that itself is indicative of the depth of his character. There's no need to exclude him any longer. And then he was immediately reunited with Mahaprabhu. So here, Chakravarti Pad is saying, one may attain, one may not attain, but one can't give up one's eagerness. One can't think of pursuing something else or letting go of one's attachment, one's affinity for that object. So when this type of indomitable pursuit is perceived or is felt, then that is a criterion, or that is an indicator of what is called hankering, or intense desire. So those are what you might call positive effects, or when this desire is present in the psyche, then you will see the manifestation of these type of attitudes and behaviors. So there'll also be what you might call a negative effect, or when this desire is there, then certain behaviors will not arise. Certain behaviors will be terminated, or will be unable, will be, what do you call that? Not impeded, but I forget the word. Anyway, where they don't even have the scope to arise at all. So Jiva Gosvami states this as follows. Jiva Gosvami also describes the negative effect of this intense desire, that is taste, as giving rise to the absence of any liking, or you could say pleasure, relish, interest, or inclination for anything other than the desired object. He cites the following verse in this regard. Quote, that, meaning intense desire, upon flourishing, produces disinterest in all else in a person endowed with Shraddha. He later elaborates on the depth of this disinterest as follows, quote, one endowed with such taste, ruchi, however, has no desire even for the bliss of the non-repetition of birth and so on. That is, no desire for any variety of moksha, and no desire for any of the pleasures that can be attained through adherence to dharma. Much less desire for anything that is an object of repugnance. That is, much less any pleasure that contravenes the directives of Shastra, that is a dharmic. Because of all such things from the bliss of moksha on down, being detested by the bhakta by virtue of that taste. So, when desire becomes so strongly fixed on a particular object, even other objects that might conventionally be considered also nice or also good will no longer be felt to be such. In other words, conventionally speaking, we might say, would you like some dessert? And would you like vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream? And if someone has no particular desire, they might say, well, either one will do. There's no problem either way. But if someone, for whatever reason or circumstance, were such that they were absolutely desirous of having one particular dessert, let's call it vanilla ice cream, then even if you offered them chocolate, they wouldn't eat it. They'll say, no. I can't have anything else. I won't, nothing else will do. Even something else that might be pleasurable, or it might be nice, or you might say, what's wrong with that? Or it also has many good qualities. But when the more specific the desire becomes, the more exclusive it becomes of other things. So not just things that are unpleasurable, but even pleasurable things become excluded. So this statement of Jiva Goswami comes in the context of a passage where he's justifying how Raganuga-bhakti is not outside the scope of Vedic stricture. Or in other words, because Shastra, as a broad social, institution, as an institution in society, is something that's for the purpose of governing people. The Shas Dhatu in Sanskrit means to regulate or to govern. So Shastra is that which guides society or guides human beings. So broadly speaking, the whole purpose of all of these texts is to guide people towards beneficial behavior, ideal behavior. So, and the principal way that that's done is through injunctions and through a concept of textual authority, that the text is fit to be obeyed. The text commands you to do this, therefore do it. This is the logic of the Mimamsa, the original four Vedas. They're written, as it's said in a passage in the Tattva Sandarbha, like the decrees of a king. He just ordered. He doesn't have to tell you you have to obey. It's just the law. Whether you know or you don't know, you're still legally bound to obey, and you're still held accountable for disobeying. So, classically, Shastra is based on that sort of culture of injunction. So now when you say that Raganuga-bhakti is something that's not motivated by injunctions, then people can get on the edge of their seats and say, what are you doing here? You're contradicting the very premise of this entire body of texts. You're contradicting the whole concept of Shastra. So Jiva Goswami goes into an elongated discussion to say, no, that's not the case. Although there is a divergence, or although this is actually not based on injunction, still, if you look at the effect of what this path is, it produces the effect that the path of injunction is trying to produce to an even more efficient degree. Or rather, someone will ultimately become dharmic, or ultimately become free from adharmic behavior and attitudes to a more profound extent by following this path than they will even by the conventional path of injunction. This is the point he's in the process of making. So to make that point, he's saying that when this ruchi, or when this taste, becomes very strong for this particular object, then there's what to speak of people engaging in adharma, which is only a way to experience very crude or egotistical pleasures. People won't even have interest in pious pleasures. They won't even have interest in moksha. They won't have interest in anything else. So the idea that they'll then go and do some behavior that's detrimental to society is just, there's not even the scope for it to arise. It's just not possible. This is the argument that he's making to, so to speak, justify to the hypothetical objector why this path of sadhana is still to be considered within the fold of the Veda, although it's not based on the concept of motivating people using injunction. But what's more, that's the context of the discussion, but for our purpose, we can also consider it on a practical level as a tool for introspection. So we may feel, yes, I want this goal, or I have some belief in this creed, or something like this, but we can identify, or we can see the gap, so to speak, between what our, quote, belief, or what our intellectual interest, or what our so-called desire may be, also by examining the extent to which that desire has actually exterminated desire, inclination, pleasure in other things. So if we say, yes, I'm interested in Raganuga-bhakti, and I have, hobby 1 and hobby 3 and interest 4 and pleasure 6 and all these other things going on, quote unquote, on the side, then that can help us understand that our desire is not actually very strong. It's maybe not even worth being called intense desire. It might be lukewarm, it might be light, and that's not nothing. We don't want to belittle that. Any degree of desire for this most noble object is praiseworthy and is to be cherished with great care and honored as something of the great fortune within the heart. No doubt, we don't want to belittle even a slight presence of such a thing. But nevertheless, we also want to use this principle to help us understand where we might be on that, 0 to 100 scale, so to speak, and how many, anarthas, how many other unfavorable elements of psychic conditioning may still be present with us. So, in summary, you have the positive effect that the mind will gravitate, the mind will fixate, the mind will become to that extent one-pointed on the goal, and proportionately to the one-pointedness upon the object, there will be the absence of attention, the absence of interest, the absence of liking for things other than that object. So this is like two sides of the same coin. And Sri Jiva later goes on to state a further implication of this. Quote, therefore, there is naturally just no propensity in one who has such taste for that, meaning for any action that contravenes the directives of Shastra. So, I don't think I need to explain that, I already given the context. The import here is that taste, that is intense desire, for a particular form of ragatmika bhakti, is such that it will eradicate desire for all else from the psyche. And the concrete effect of this will be that no propensity to perform actions contrary to that desire will remain in the mind. Thus, one will become free from all forms of vice and misconduct, and have a natural propensity to engage in all forms of action that are conducive to the attainment of one's desired object. So Jiva Goswami says further in this regard, quote, a propensity to perform the actions enjoined in Bhakti Shastra, and a non-propensity to perform the actions forbidden in Bhakti Shastra, shall come about entirely naturally for one endowed with the aforementioned taste for a raga related to him, namely Bhagavan, because of his satisfaction being the very life of the manifestation of priti, that is, prema for Bhagavan. So this is a beautiful remark, that the very life of this raga, or even of taste of this raga, is the satisfaction of Bhagavan. So, if we go back to the root of all of this, the intrinsic characteristic of raga was defined as prema moy Krishna, or this loving desire for Bhagavan. So that's elaborated on by Jiva Goswami in his definition of priti in the Priti Sandarbha, and where he explains this phrase, tad anukulyatmika, tad anukulyatmika, tad anukulyanugata tad spriha, where he says that there will be, what is priti? It is that which is made up of anukulya, or action which is pleasing to Bhagavan, and tad anukul yanu gata tad spriha, and a desire for him which is itself following from or an expression of anukulya. So the very heart, the very root of the thing is pleasing Bhagavan, satisfying Bhagavan, and even the underlying purpose or the underlying impelling force of even one's desire for Bhagavan is the aim of satisfying Bhagavan. So in that sense, he's saying here that Bhagavan's satisfaction being the very life of the manifestation of priti. So in other words, if what one cherishes at the very core of one's heart and what one intensely desires to the exclusion of all else is this bhava, the essential core of which is trying to please Bhagavan, is performing or acting or being pleasing to Bhagavan, then if one desires that, and that is the driving factor in the functioning of one's psyche, then where will there be a propensity for doing something displeasing to Bhagavan? Where will there be a propensity to do things that are against what is taught for bhaktas in the Shastra? It just won't be there, proportionate to the extent to which this type of ruchi has come. So, those who are followers of the Ragatmikas residing in Sri Gokula and elsewhere, and devoted to them, perform Vaishnava practices and conventional dharma practices only with their, that is, those Ragatmika bhaktas, disposition and intention, which is constituted of an object of desire, such as Sri Krishna's well-being or the negation of obstacles to meeting with him. So this is to say that a bhakta in the course of their life may also, according to social circumstances, perform actions that appear like or resemble conventional forms of dharma, or they may engage with the sadhaka deha and various conventional forms of Vaishnava dharma. But what's most significant is not those actions, but the motivation and the aspiration for those actions. So he's saying here that these type of Raganuga-bhakti sadhakas, their inner intention in all that they do, even whatever may be superficially an act of conventional dharma, is done with the spirit of the Brajabasis. It's done with the attitude that this will lead to the pleasure of Krishna, this will lead to the well-being of Krishna, or this will help in the fulfillment of Krishna's desire, or this will be part of the pursuit of uniting Radha and Krishna, what have you. These different types of ideals or notions of how Bhagavan is to be satisfied, this will be the underlying current or thread of what inspires them to do whatever it is they're doing. So when they have that as their primary aim and object, that they'll go do something that's completely irrelevant to that, it just won't occur to the extent that this desire is actually there. So that's the point being made here. And now finally I have one last characteristic. This is pulled out of a passage in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita commentary. Finally, in this regard, Sri Sanatana Gosvami Pad can be seen to describe overcoming shyness and concern for society as characteristics of intense desire. So in other words, if someone truly desires this thing, then whether that makes them popular or unpopular in society, whether that's part of the dominant culture on their continent or in their nation or in their state or in their neighborhood, becomes utterly irrelevant to them. And whether people think they're weird or people think their dress is strange or the marks on their forehead are unknown or whatever it is that people might be shy about or might have social concerns about, those things go out the window when someone is intensely desirous of this thing. This is, I'm just putting it in sort of a practical context. At the same time, does that mean that one will necessarily behave recklessly in their social circumstances? No. They may also be practical about what will be most efficacious for their personal life in the social circumstances they're in, and there may be contexts where wearing Vaishnava dress or doing certain things that are so visibly social can lead to untoward consequences that lead to distraction or obstacles in the execution of one's sadhana. So it's not that one has to become like a brazen, person just acting recklessly. One will, use strategy. One will use common sense about how to navigate in society. But if they choose to, what they choose to do, it won't be out of shyness. It won't be out of fear. It won't be out of, a sense of social awkwardness about being seen to be odd. This type of superficial hang-up, if you will not be there. So that, lastly, is another characteristic. So now I have a recap of these. In summary, one can infer the extent to which intense desire, lobha, that is, taste, ruchi, for a specific form of Raganuga-bhakti has appeared in one's mind by observing 1. The relative extent to which the mind naturally gravitates towards and remains fixed upon that object of desire, without the prompting of injunctions and reasoning, that is, without having to discipline or reason with the mind, repeatedly draw it back from distractions, and so on. Number 2, the relative extent to which one feels strong inclination and elation in regard to the means by which one can attain this object of desire, meaning towards the practices of Raganuga sadhana bhakti. 3. The relative extent to which one remains eager regardless of one's degree of success. 4. The relative extent to which one loses liking or pleasure, relish, interest, or inclination for all else. 5. The relative extent to which one loses the propensity to engage in any type of action that is contrary to attainment of one's desired object. And 6. The relative extent to which one feels no shyness or social inhibitions about one's pursuit of one's object of desire. Sri Chakravarti Pad summarizes all this by saying, quote, "The intense desire of bhaktas following the path of raga becomes greater and greater every day in accord with the degree of purification of the psyche caused by bhakti. The sense being that, as Sri Jiva Pad has explained elsewhere, purity of the psyche, or chitta shuddhi, essentially means the state in which the psyche fosters one pointed intention upon priti, that is a form of ragatmika bhakti, and is purged of all other intentions." So this is a very significant statement, which comes in the Priti Sandarbha, saying, "Anya tatparya parityag priti tatparyam cha." What is purification of the psyche? This is, for those on the Bhakti Marg, for those following the Gaudiya line of thought, this is like really condensing the essence of the whole concept into one phrase. What does it mean to have a purified mind on this path with this as the goal? That one has one pointed intention upon the type of Ragatmika Bhakti that one aspires to, in other words, upon that type of Krishna Prem, and no intention for anything else. That is purity of mind. In other words, when the mind is purely focused on this, no untoward, distracting, contrary element is present there. So, what we can understand then is that this concept of eligibility is directly proportionate with chitta shuddhi. So, as I mentioned in one of the earlier discussions, in the context of Vaidhi Bhakti, Rupa Goswami mentions 3 aspects to the adhikar, or the eligibility: the shraddha, the yukti, in other words, conviction in the shastra, in the object that the shastra is teaching, the shastrartha vishas, shastra yukti, understanding of the reasoning, the principles that the shastra is teaching regarding that object, and 3, the relative purification of the psyche. This is what you can gather from the whole prakaran in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu on that topic. So here, when we're talking about the adhikar for Raganuga-bhakti, then we can see that this, quote, lobha or intense desire will come into the psyche to the extent that chitta-shuddhi has occurred. They're directly proportionate, in other words. So to say that chitta-shuddhi is part of the adhikar then becomes automatic, or it becomes a directly demonstrated conclusion by means of this tika of Chakravartipad. In light of all this, the commentator on the verse under discussion explains the meaning of the word further, or api, in the third line of the verse as follows. As awareness, matiḥ, imbued with kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa, that is, ragatmika bhakti, is difficult to attain, durlabha, so too is the price for it. Meaning, the quote, hankering, laulyam, mentioned in the verse under discussion, which equates to what Sri Rupa calls the eligibility for ragatmika bhakti, that is, intense desire in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and what Sri Jiva speaks of as taste, ruchi. So, I have to say, this point of the commentator here is one of my favorite points that he's made in all of the commentaries that we've discussed so far. I felt that the way that he paired the api with this particular word and made this point, I thought was so spot on with the prakaran and the rest of the Goswami's siddhānta and the way this verse is composed. I really appreciated this point from the commentator. And it's what inspired me to make this elaborate illustration of what he's saying by putting all these points together from the Goswami's works. So in summary, the spirit of the verse, or the intent of the verse, is not just that ragatmika bhakti is hard to attain, or is difficult to attain, or prema is difficult to attain, but that prema, ragatmika bhakti, that is certainly difficult to attain. And the price to get it, that is also difficult to attain. So that, you could say, is like a kaimutyanai, or an a fortiori argument to further strengthen the point being made, the rarity or the preciousness of Krishna Prema. So these 6 characteristics that I've presented, quoting from Rupa Goswami, Jiva Goswami, Vishwanath Chakravarti, show how this price is hard to achieve, or what a high price that it is. In other words, as it was explained, I heard in one talk, this is that which is attained at the expense of all else. Which is another way of saying there's nothing that can cost more than this. If you can only attain something in exchange for everything else you have, that means it's the most expensive thing that there could ever be. So that's, in other words, what has to be put on the table. That's ultimately the price that one has to pay. One has to forsake every other possible desirable or other object otherwise in order to achieve this. So, considering all of this, or the weight of such statements, what can we understand? Sri Jiva also describes this taste as, guess what? Rarely found. Viral. And his aforementioned description of the heart of someone in whom such taste is present, being like a crystalline jewel shining brightly with the reflection of the rays from the moon of a particular raga, indicates that the heart of such a person shall shine in this manner to the extent that it is purified of contaminants in the form of desires and vasanas for other objects. So this, I should footnote that. I think this is, if I remember right, this is in the Bengali purport of Sri Pranagopal Goswami on a passage in the Bhakti Sandarbha. I thought this was an insightful point, where he's extrapolating, if you will, on Jiva Goswami's metaphor. If the heart is like this illuminated crystal that the moonlight of this raga is making bright, then this commentator is saying is that the very analogy of comparing the heart to a shining crystal implies that the heart is pure, implies that the heart is clear. It's not obstructed, it's not covered with contaminants or dirt or dust or what have you. So it implies that this taste or this ruchi, which is filling the heart, is something that's only there to the extent that there's the absence of dirt in the heart. Because if you've ever gone crystal hunting or finding, when you find them out in the, they're usually covered in mud and some other things, and they usually have some other type of rock or hard matter that's on them, and it's only, when all of that is washed and polished and all this, that the thing actually looks much like what we think of as a crystal. So if the thing is dirty, muddy, caked with all these other layers of earth on it and so forth, it doesn't shine at all. So the implication being that if the heart with this taste is shining like a luminous crystal, then obviously it's a heart that's quite pure. So that's the import he's drawing out from this metaphor of Jiva Gosvami, which further illustrates the idea that the presence of this degree of illumination or this degree of purity that enables this illumination is a rare thing, and we shouldn't think it to be cheap or easily attained or widely available or commonly had, so to speak. That doesn't mean we should think that it's so impossible that there's nothing to say about it or it's not worth pursuing. Also not that either. We should have both a very strong and clear idea of how rare, how fine, how great it is, and let us also aspire for that fine, great, rare thing. We want to have both aspects of our approach solid in that respect. So I'll continue here. All of this should be understood, however, as was explained in the passage of Sri Chakravarti Pad above, to, in most cases, come about gradually. Quote, the intense desire of bhaktas following the path of raga becomes greater and greater every day, in accord with the degree of purification of the psyche caused by bhakti. Thus, a sadhaka may initially have only a mild degree of desire, that is, taste, and many extraneous desires and vasanas may likely remain in the heart. But gradually, as the process unfolds, the extraneous elements will be purified, and the taste will become more and more intense. The various degrees of this gradual purification are explained by Sri Chakravarti Pad in his discussion of the sensation of detriments, or anartha nivritti, in his Madhurya Kandambani, on the basis of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 1.4.15.16. So this is the Shraddha, Sadhu Sangha, Bhajana Kriya, Anartha Nivritti, Nishta, Ruchi, Asakti, Bhava, Prema, this ninefold degree or stages in which prema self-manifests into the heart of a sadhaka. In that regard, Chakravarti Pad gives an elaborate analysis in Madhurya Kadambani about where and at what stage which anartas are removed and to which extent. And he gives somewhat degrees of removal or degrees of cessation, somewhat, mostly, almost completely, and then completely without the possibility of recession or without the possibility of it coming back. And then anarthas produced by pious activity, by impious activity, by offense, and even arising from bhakti itself, these four categories he gives. And then he shows how at which stages they recede and to which extent. So all of that analysis of those subtleties helps us understand that this whole concept of adhikar, this whole concept of desire, is not ever going to be like a 0 to 1 or a 0 to 100 transformation like a light switch. It's something that's going to come about gradually, and it's going to come about as a result of perseverant practice. In the case of the great majority, because Jiva Gosvami also gives the explanation in the Bhakti Sandarbha that if someone is completely free from aparat, completely free from unfavorable psychic conditioning, a little bit of bhakti and immediately prem can manifest. And that's very true. But that's very rare. So the analogy is given like water in the log. If a log is perfectly dry, you can light it up and it'll blaze up quickly. But if a log is waterlogged, then you can put it right into a blazing fire and it won't burn anytime soon. It won't burn at all, or it'll just create some smoke and be unpleasant for everyone. So, depending on the relative state of purification in any given individual, there will be a relative degree of this expression or presence of this positive thing of the growth of this desire. So we can't compare ourselves with others. We can't say that one is necessarily practicing better or worse than another. Where one has started in a given lifetime in comparison to another may also not be comparable. All we can ultimately do is carefully understand these teachings, carefully introspect about the state of our own minds, and carefully try to follow the path and have appreciation for all who also aspire to do so, wheresoever they may be in that process. So, again, what I want to stress is that these comments, they show that this is a gradual process, and so that there will be this, quote, intense desire, and that there's nothing to be done in relation to, quote unquote, Raganuga sadhana bhakti unless and until this desire is already intense. This is not the idea. The Goswamis, they're writing this knowing very well that people are going to be coming into this path in posterity, hundreds of years, whatever later from the time that they write, and they're writing this full stop. In other words, they're writing this for society at large, which means to factor in the different levels and degrees of people becoming involved in the tradition from wherever they're at. So there is a way to follow this path starting from ground zero. It has to be there, otherwise it wouldn't be an actual path. And we wouldn't hear statements that it's the path of Raganuga-bhakti alone that leads to the attainment of Braja Bhakti, that leads to attainment of the Unata Ujjala Rasa that Mahaprabhu came to give. This path that is the only path to achieve the goal that is the prime spiritual aspiration cherished within the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition is not something that's, cut off or unable to be followed by hardly anyone. Rather, it's extremely difficult and challenging to advance all the way to its advanced stages, but there is a way to enter it, there is a way to approach it, there is a way to allow it to unfold in one's life gradually with an understanding of one's relative degree or relative lack of eligibility for it in whatever state one may find oneself. So, this point will be taken up further in what comes. In other words, I'll just read this passage and then because we're almost up to an hour, so I don't want to launch into this, because this then goes into a further point and explanation about what to do with the sadhakas who are not very qualified, or if this intense desire is the qualification and some person is, quote, interested or trying to follow this path but has very little eligibility, then what to do with such a person? Because even in the case of Vaidhi Bhakti, Shraddha, that's also, it's explained in the Sindhu itself, that there's soft faith, very firm faith. There's a recognition of a grayscale gradual intensification. Same thing goes with knowledge. The yukti, there's a gradual progression in understanding of the subtleties of the path, the process, etc. The purification of the psyche also is unfolding gradually from 0% to 100%. So similarly, the desire is going from 0 and ideally will gradually increase. So what to do in the case of someone who has enough interest in the path to want to dedicate themselves to the path, to want to embrace this path as their path, but yet has relatively little strength or relatively little depth of this thing that is what's enabling them to take it up. So Jiva Goswami writes in this regard, Raganuga-bhakti too, which is honored just by honoring a particular sadhu, that is, a particular ragatmika associate of Bhagavan, is to be practiced in conjunction with Vaidhi bhakti, that is, bhakti directed by Shastric injunctions, by those in whom such taste has not appeared, that is, those in whom taste for such a specific form of Raganuga-bhakti has appeared or is relatively weak. And it is also to be practiced by those in whom such taste has appeared and who are established in society, that is, those whose conduct is being followed by others for the sake of social cohesion. So this is a very interesting point, and it's something that's not mentioned in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu or the commentaries on the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So this is a very significant point about the practice of Raganuga-bhakti that you find only in the Bhakti Sandarbha. So what he's saying here is, broadly speaking, just to honor, just to have regard for some particular ragatmika associates of Bhagavan is enough for one to take up the path, to honor them, to regard them, to think, this is the greatest thing, I aspire to this, to honor them. That can make one, or that is sufficient to bring one to take up the path. But if then intense desire or this taste to achieve that is not there, or, and by extension in the context, or is relatively weak, then what is someone to do? So he's saying that what is to be done? Then the support of injunctions, the support of Vaidhi Bhakti is also to be blended or also to be combined into one's sadhana to support the growth of that desire, to support the strength or the emergence of the eligibility to follow the Raganuga path. So how then does that blending or how does that supporting take place? That's what we'll discuss next time when we read the next passage and continue with this discussion. And hopefully, well, we'll see if we'll get through the rest of it next time. We'll also see some very important analysis from Radhakrishna Das Goswami about the practical, the practice of Raganuga sadhana in this regard. So I'll conclude here for today, and if anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or other feedback, feel free to share. Let me open this. Yes? Yes, Vidiji, you have something?
Radha. Yes, Radha. Pranam. I have a question. I do have a question. Because everything is circulating around the verse kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa-bhāvitā matiḥ, right? Krīyatāṁ yadi kuto'pi labhyate. So, Rupa Goswami, he's talking about bhakti rasa. And wherever it's available, one who has desire to obtain it should grab it wherever it comes from. Now, two points. One has to have already established some recognition of what bhakti rasa is in order to see it, where it comes from, recognize it. Is it not?
Definitely.
So to whom this verse is addressed to?
The persons who have that knowledge.
It's not for regular sadhaka.
It is for them. They're the ones who have some idea what that is and desire to attain it.
Okay, yeah, but when we talk about bhakti rasa, we talk about actually rasa that somebody can experience, and this whole Ujjwala Nilamani deals with actually topic of rasa. And So my question rather could be, another question would be, is there a difference between bhakti, which is used profusely in any context, anywhere in Shastra, versus bhakti rasa specifically? Because from my understanding so far, I understand bhakti rasa is of a specific nature and it's meant to be tasted, as opposed to bhakti in general, expression of devotion, expression of desire to serve. So I'd like to understand, is there any, I'm not sure there is a definition of what bhakti rasa is, but I'm pretty sure it's different from what general understanding of bhakti is. Can you comment on that, please?
Well, in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, we see the progression. First, Uttama Bhakti is defined. Then 3 manifestations of Uttama Bhakti are defined: sadhana, bhava, and prema. And then after prema bhakti is explained, then bhakti rasa is explained. And bhakti rasa is said to be constituted of 5 elements: the sthayi bhava, the vibhavas, the anubhavas, the sattvika bhavas, and the vyabhachari bhavas. So prema bhakti is then has subcategories of specific types of sthayi bhava, and then those sthayi bhavas become excited, if you will, by the the udipanas, and on the basis of the different types of vibhavas, without going into all the technicalities of it, and then that gives rise to the experience of rasa. So bhakti rasa is, one way you could summarize it in essence, is the experience of having bhakti, meaning the experience of having prema bhakti. When one has prema bhakti, when one has a sthayi bhava, then that, in the course of one's awareness becoming directed towards anything related to the vibhavas, Krishna, then there's the experience of that bhakti, or the quote rasa of that bhakti, which one then comes to taste.
Okay, so you just said that bhakti rasa is tasted on a platform of prema. Somebody who has prema, he can taste it. He takes all these 5 ingredients of rasa and taste the rasa. So my conclusion is that the verse Rupa Gosvami quotes, puts in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa-bhāvitā is basically addressed to premic bhaktas, or these bhāvuka bhaktas. Is that right?
It's saying one who wants to achieve that experience. So the people who already have that, you don't need to tell them to go look for it. They're already experiencing it. So this verse is an instruction, right? It's a verb which says buy, purchase. So you don't give instructions to people who are already perfected. You give instructions to people who are in want and in need of guidance, who are imperfect and who are seeking still to achieve something. So kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa-bhāvitā, this is the object that one is being instructed to pursue. So you don't instruct the people who already have the goal to pursue the goal. You tell the people who don't have it to go get it. In other words, you don't tell a kid, if a kid is neglecting going to school, you tell them you need to go to school. But the kids who are all sitting there in school, you don't tell them you better keep staying in school. It's like they already go to school. Then you just educate them. So instructions have always a particular audience of those who need to be given that particular guidance.
I understand. Or it could be speaking basically in broader sense to advanced bhaktas, and specifically meaning Vraja Bhakti Rasa, that particular Bhakti Rasa he's talking about through, as a development of Mahaprabhu's conception, that Vraja Bhakti Rasa should be obtained wherever you find it. You should look for it anywhere. But it's to be addressed to, those bhaktas who have rasa already. Would that be the case as well? Because, my question is again coming from the point that if you don't have bhakti rasa, how would you recognize it? It just doesn't really.
Well, you would recognize the characteristics of its presence, right? So we're told so many characteristics of a Vaishnava. The Bhagavatam explains so many statements about what are the nature of an Uttam Vaishnava. Evam Brata Swapriya Nama. What is that? That verse spoken about Mahaprabhu. When the heart is melted by the chanting of the names of the beloved, one laughs and dances and sings and cries and doesn't care about society, and one is disinterested in the wealth of, Brahma, anything that can be attained in the three worlds, because Bhagavan is bound within the heart by the rope of love. These statements about Uttam Bhaktas, the general person will acquire this knowledge, they'll acquire some idea about what are the symptoms, what are the activities of the persons who are having that experience of rasa, and they'll also, by hearing about that experience, desire to have that experience for themselves, and then they'll seek to find sadhus, they'll seek to find persons who have that experience or have knowledge about the process to pursue that experience, and then they'll seek to learn from them, to be blessed by them. This is what's being described.
Okay. But you mentioned general qualities of advanced Vaishnavas who are disinterested with this world, but it doesn't mean that they have rasa. Right? They're not necessarily equal. Someone who has rasa and someone who's detached and aloof from this world, you understand what I'm saying?
Well, as we mentioned, when Rupa Goswami says that arocha-kata, the absence of taste for anything else, is one of the characteristics of bhava bhakti. So it's not the only characteristic, but it's one characteristic. So obviously we can't identify a rasik bhakta merely by that characteristic, but it's also one characteristic that's important in the identification process.
Was there any specific description of bhaktas who taste the rasa actually?
It's right in the Bhakti-rasa-bhāvitā Sindhu. You've read these things, it's the verses I mentioned in the Bhagavatam, those are said to be descriptions of that very thing.
Yes, as I'm saying, that some qualities are common to bhaktas, to all advanced sages, but we don't know exactly if they have rasa or not. They have, because the things that what's my problem understanding is that if rasa is described as the combination of these five elements, somebody has to have all these five elements that consist to tasting bhakti rasa. My understanding is that there's some specific qualities of those who actually taste the rasa, not know about it, just know about it and have some pick from it.
These things are all meticulously explained in the Chaitanya Charitamrita and the Bhakti-rasa-bhāvitā Sindhu. There's a stack of characteristics. How does it go? I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's samskar ujjala chetasa. It's not coming to my mind. One sec. Let me pull that verse up.
What? Okay, thank you.
One second here. I used to have that is it? It's 2, 1, something. Where is that? Let me get it over here. Here it is. Bhakti nirdutta doshanam prasannato jalachetasam Sri Bhagavata Raktanam Rasika-rangada-tika Jivani bhuta govinda pada bhakti sukashriyam premantaranga bhutani krityani anushtitam bhaktanam hridi rajanti sanskar yugalojala ratirananda rupaiva niyamana tu rasyatam kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa-bhāvitā gatoir-anubhavadyadvani prodhananda chamatkara kṛṣṇa-bhakti-rasa-bhāvitā param. This is the verse.
Where's it from?
I'll send you a link to it.
Okay. Okay. Okay, fine, thank you. So I guess mostly things are elaborated in Raganuga Samvad, I believe in Chantarashramita.
Yeah, chapter 23 specifically discusses this, and the Bhakti Rasa, if you want to know what is Bhakti Rasa, the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is your manual. So Rupa Goswami has definitely covered these things, and the verse I'm referring to and others, these are, he's laid it out completely systematically. Of course, does it necessarily mean that by reading these characteristics that we're going to be able to walk around and, examine people and say this or say that?
Oh yeah.
Not entirely. Obviously, it's the grace of Bhagavan that anyone meets, a Vaishnava of a very great stature. But nevertheless, this knowledge is given, and these parameters are there to understand, in general, the possibility or impossibility of certain elements, and one can, weed through many things, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, let's conclude for today. And in our next discussion, we'll go further into some of the practical side of how this process is performed and what elements of it are most essential. So I'll leave it at that. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.